The job centre was sort of like, oh, okay, you're doing something. That's good. At least you're doing something. And they sort of let you do it. And I've talked about this before. I really worry about people from my background not being able to do that now. Yeah, that it's not just work hard and, there's a lot of luck involved in how I did what I ended up doing. You might think you're the only one dealing with this, dealing with a student or a child that's struggling in school, but you're not, and we're going to do something about it. There's no way anyone's going to take you seriously. It pushed so many sort of painful buttons for me about my background. I used to sort of like go to bed with like the manuals for like my sampler and just be reading it like in bed.
Curtis James grew up on the Whitehall Council estate in Brighton. He left school at 16 with 1 GCSE, and he never imagined he'd work in media, let alone own a home. But a teacher lent him and his twin brother some music equipment, helped them apply for a Prince's Trust grant, and that opened the door into music and into radio. Years later, Curtis co-founded Class Divide. It's an independent campaign led by parents, residents, and experts on the estate he grew up on, and it's been challenging the systems that hold working class kids back. They've already won real change in Brighton. Now they're looking at how that work goes national, while staying rooted in the community. In 2025, a project he worked on with his brother Simon and a load of local kids called Neolithic Cannibals won Sound of the Year, and this is his story. Welcome, Curtis. How was that? Are you okay?
Yeah. Thank you for having me, James. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been a long time coming, and it's interesting how I came across your podcast and then just reached out to you, and yeah, it's really interesting. Looking forward to going into your story and everything about what you've been up to and stuff. So this series is about those from working class and lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And the one question I always ask everyone is, how would you define what working class is?
Oh God, it's like so complicated, that question. And I'm thinking about it like so much. I think like I've gone from quite a naive, I guess, understanding or sort of knowledge about what that means. And for me, it was just like really simplistic, probably, that I grew up in a council estate and I just thought that, like, probably if you grew up in a council estate, you were probably working class. And maybe that was right like 20, 30 years ago, but I don't know if that's the case now. Yeah, so I think it's a lot more complicated, and I lived on a council estate 30 years ago. So,
Yeah.
my life is a bit different to when I was sort of living with my parents and sort of growing up and going to school. So that's a sort of long-winded way of saying, I don't really know. I don't really know exactly how to define it, but probably my best way of describing it is that, it's a mix of growing up, living in or closer to poverty. I didn't
Yeah.
grow up in poverty. I did, my dad had a job, and, we were never completely on, the poverty line. But we didn't have much. So I think, growing up near or around that sort of poverty line, growing up in social housing, growing up sort of, around people who maybe, but like me and my family, education-wise, I guess hadn't really done that much or fared too well in the education system. So yeah, slightly sort of long-winded way of trying to describe it. But yeah, as I said before, I don't know if I really know yet.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, as I've always spoken to some of the different guests on this podcast, and it does range massively, and it is. I've always found it's dependent on that individual's lived experience, and but I think there are elements that kind of are across each individual story. So yeah, it is a very complex topic, and sometimes it feels like that's kind of an outdated term to kind of use now. But so for the viewers and listeners, what is it that you currently do? What's your day to day?
So I guess I've got a day job. I run I call it a company, but it's like me. And sometimes I have some freelancers that I get in to do some
Mm.
stuff with me. So it's mainly me. And I do like a whole load of stuff, but most of it is around documenting community or people's lives, and sometimes that's delivered in podcasts, sometimes it's delivered in some sort of event or an exhibition or a book, some sort of publication. So, but the main sort of bread and butter of my work is basically being a bit nosy, hanging out with
Mhm.
people, documenting their lives in some shape or form, yeah, and then finding a good way to share them. So that's my day job. In my spare time, of which I don't have that much, I, together with a bunch of other people, volunteer for a thing called Class Divide, which you mentioned in the intro. It's a education campaign that sort of sprung out of the community that I grew up in, the community I went to school with, and actually the place where one half of my family, like my mum and my gran, sort of lived all of their lives. Um, and it's a place that is, I guess over the decades, it's a council estate and it's sort of not really been listened to. It's sort of pretty
Yeah.
unheard. And yeah, so we've been doing loads of work to basically try and change the outcomes for kids and families on the estate. So yeah, that's my spare time. In the intro, you said I founded it. I'm sort of one of the co-founders, and I guess none of us really own it. It's like a sort of real joint
Yeah.
thing. I guess some of us do a bit more day to day, but yeah, it's like a real joint effort between quite a lot of people.
I just wanted to go back to your beginnings and how you
Mm.
started out. It's like in the intro, I talk about your one GCSE and the fact that you managed to get into media and radio. Could you tell us about that journey?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned sort of like leaving school with sort of that one GCSE. My life at school wasn't particularly fun. I didn't really enjoy quite a lot of it. I found it sort of I was a lot more interested in hanging out in the drama studio or in the
Mm.
music sort of room, and so I avoided all the academic subjects in any way I could. And that sort of meant that I left school with just one GCSE, like a GCSE in drama. I didn't even get a C. Maybe I did get a C, so at least I passed, I
Mm.
guess. I think that's a pass. Um, and but I was really into a whole bunch of stuff. I was into music. I was into sort of, I guess, performance, and it was around the time when I guess dance music was like really sort of growing and exploding. And I went from like on a Thursday evening watching Top of the Pops and it being quite your typical pop music
Yeah.
to all of a sudden, like acts like 808 State and all sorts of like pretty cool dance acts starting to appear. And they all had these really cool synthesizers and record decks and samplers and these things that I started to just become obsessed with wanting to own and learn how to use and sort of make my own music. Um, and even though school wasn't the best, I had a music teacher that I didn't study music, but I used to hang out in his room all the time. And when I left school, he lent me and my brother some equipment that he owned. It was his own personal equipment. And we just started playing around with it. We had no idea what we were doing. I didn't even know if he gave us an instruction manual. We just sort of were trying to tinker and work it all out. And then this thing was announced, and I'd never heard of it. I think it was like brand new, the Prince's Trust.
Yeah.
And he was like, "I'll help you write an application. Why don't you write an application and you can buy some of your own equipment?" And we did that and waited and waited for what felt like an absolute eternity. I remember we got to probably 6 weeks in and we were like phoning the office where we'd sent our
Mm.
application form every day. Basically, I'm surprised they didn't just turn us down because we were so annoying.
Huh.
But in the end, they got in touch with us and they were like, "We're going to give you £1,600, which I think I looked it up the other day is the equivalent to about £5,000 in today's money."
Yeah.
So they gave us that money, and it was a grant, so we didn't have to pay it back. And we basically bought a sampler, an effects machine, and something else I can't remember. But we just started making music. We just started like basically making demos, and there was another chance sort of encounter. We sort of became friendly with a DJ in Brighton, and he was making music. His name's Dave Clark, and he was like a big techno sort of person. Or actually, at the time, he wasn't big, but he was making records.
Yeah.
And he just set up like a little label, and like, I probably a year or 2 into that label starting, we've been sending him demos and giving him demos whenever we saw him. I mean, I was actually his dog sitter. I was, like, looking after his dogs when he was, like, going to, like, all around the world DJing, so that's sort of the relationship. Um, and yeah, they liked some of the tracks that me and my brother had made and signed us. I say signed us, they gave us £100 advance, and I think they probably pressed maybe 500 copies, maybe 1,000 copies of this record
Yeah.
on bright green fluorescent vinyl, which was just amazing. Honestly, I remember, like, the postman knocking at the door with the first copies of it, and it's sort of hard to explain what that felt like. It was, like, magical and, after years of, like, lusting over vinyl and being really interested in
Yeah.
music, to have a piece of vinyl with something you'd made on it. I don't know, and I don't mean to sound, like, old and sort of, but I don't know if you would ever get that today, because when you release a
Oh, the
piece of music, you can
tangible
just put it
stuff.
online.
Yeah,
Whereas back then it was so much harder. So to have this record, this physical thing that someone had gone, right, we're going to spend money getting hundreds of these pressed. It was like, wow, this is just, I remember the smell of it. And I remember first putting a needle on it and
yeah.
hearing it and going, wow, this is cool. So, that was really the start. But there's a really important part of the story that, like, probably needs to be told, and that is that, me and my brother, like, we sort of moved out of home at that time,
Yeah.
partly out of necessity. Our mum was, like, struggling with some mental health stuff, and that had been going on all through our, like, secondary school times, and she's not around now. She passed away, like, 10 years ago. Um, but, like, we were, like, on housing benefit and signing
Yeah.
on. So that's, like, an important part of the story, and I think it was for a lot of people that were making sort of music, like dance music and that sort of
Yeah.
new music that was happening at those times, that, like, you were able to sort of use the system, and in a way, the job centre was sort of like, "Oh, okay, you're doing something. That's good. At least you're doing something," and they sort of let you do it. And I've talked about this before. I really worry about people from my background not being able to do that now.
Mm.
I don't think you get away with that. I don't think you'd be allowed to sort of do that sort of thing and just, I guess teach yourself how to make music.
Yeah. So no, I guess going back to your teacher giving you that access and trust with the equipment and stuff like that. I suppose, yeah, like you said, now it would be a lot more harder for individuals to be able to kind of make a career or find something that gets them away from whatever is going on in their life. So, do
Mhm.
you find like those from working class backgrounds kind of need that kind of support and trust within the community?
Yeah, of course. I mean, God, like, it's mind blowing for me that some adults did that.
Mm.
I remember reading something, and I think this has been around a bit, like that every child should have, like, one trusted adult, and
Yeah.
that makes such a big difference. Like, and especially, if you're a kid from, like, a sort of lower socioeconomic background, and a lot of kids from those sorts of backgrounds have loads of trusted adults, but not everyone does. It's so important. And, I think, there's the trust, there's the belief, there's the sort of sense that maybe you belong in a world that you maybe didn't see yourself in. All of that stuff sort of works hand in hand. And I think some of that stuff is around now. So, even though the job centre might not be giving the sort of support they used to back in the sort of 90s when I was sort of in my late teens,
Mm.
um, you've got a whole load of programs. Like in Brighton, where Class Divide's based, you've got things like Audio Active, which, has done tons of stuff around music. I mean, stuff like that wasn't around when I was a teenager. So, to have access to those sorts of programs where there's studios you can go to, and though that part of it is amazing. But I
Yeah.
think the missing link is still that, okay, so what do you do when you just go home, or when you've just
Mm.
got to do your job and you've got no time to make music or even to go to these music studios that these brilliant charities are offering? So that for me is still like a little bit of the missing piece of the puzzle that would enable, I think, a lot more young people from sort of my kind of background into creative industries.
Yeah. And going back to, because you were quite young when you um learn how to use this equipment. Would you say that's something um a bit of a trait between the working class where they'll figure a way through. They'll work this
Hmm.
out for themselves.
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a necessity, right, that you sort of
Yeah.
have to try and do that. I don't know if I felt that at the time. I just I would like to be honest, I was obsessed. I was just
Mm.
obsessed. I used to this is gonna sound so silly, but I used to sort of, like, go to bed with, like, the manuals for, like, my sampler and just be
Yeah.
reading it, like, in bed, and I'd fall asleep. I remember once I had this really strange situation, and this had nothing to do with drugs. I've never done any drugs, but it sounds a little bit like one of those sort of drug stories. I fell asleep reading the instruction manual for a drum machine, and I remember having these really crazy lucid dreams,
Mm.
like I was inside a drum machine and I was the drum machine. I mean, like that's how obsessed I was. I was literally like dreaming about this stuff and thinking like I was the machine. So yeah, I don't know. I think that you sort of you need time, and you do, I guess, need a bit of obsessiveness to sort of like go right. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to put everything into it, and even though there are all sorts of barriers, I'm just gonna do everything I can to try and not let those get in the way. And that's and like I say, that's so easy for me to say now because I
Yeah.
had that job centre thing and I had housing benefit. Like, my story isn't really just a story about, "Oh, just work hard and you'll be able to do what I've done," because that
Yeah.
isn't the
Yeah.
case. There's a lot of luck. There were other things in place that enabled me to do those things. So, yeah, that it's not just work hard and, there's a lot of luck involved in how I did what I ended up doing.
I think people do have this impression of what council estates are, and they do get this fair bad rep. Could you tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about your experiences, and which will probably lead on to class divide? And
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I was there the other day because 'cause I'm actually planning I'm making a short film, which is actually
oh,
a little bit
nice.
about telling an alternative story about how amazing these places can
Yeah, yeah,
be.
yeah.
Um, like, the estate I grew up on is, like, one of 3 in East Brighton. You've got Whitehawk, which is probably the biggest part, Manor Farm, which is mainly houses, and then Bristol Estate, which is mainly flats, so some high-rise and some sort of, like, 3-floor flats. And Bristol Estate is sort of surrounded by grass. It's sort of like I don't know, and you're sort of on a hill, and
Mm.
so you can see the South Downs, you can see the sea, and so I would say it isn't your typical image that you might have if you think about a council estate. Um, I mean, I would say, like, the flat we lived in for the first 10 years was on the ground floor and didn't have any views. It just
Yeah.
had a view actually of, like, the entranceway, and it was really damp, and it was really yeah, it was dingy and dark
Yeah,
and
yeah.
damp and, not very well looked after, and it was hard to get stuff fixed, and but the second 10 years, like, we moved into a flat over the road, that was on the 5th floor with a balcony overlooking the sea
Oh,
and the
nice.
downs. So, I don't know, it's really sort of interesting when I sort of chat to people about council estates and, or I hear my friends or I've heard my friends over the sort of decades who maybe don't know that I grew up on one. People I know
Mm.
don't know. And there can be some quite negative language, that you hear stigma against sort of council estates.
Yeah,
And I don't know, I had an alright experience, and all my family lived there. One nan lived upstairs, another nan lived round the corner in another flat. So
yeah.
all my family were sort of quite close by, and that was good as well. It was a good community. Um, so yeah, there's still, and obviously there's stigma now, right?
Yeah.
Like people will definitely talk down places like council estates, and I do think it's pretty unfair.
No, no, it's really interesting. It's like, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my experience growing up. When I lived in London, I was on a council estate. Um, and I always vividly remember always going to the playground. It was kind of in the middle of all these blocks of flats. And it
Mm,
was kind of like, yeah, there was this community. Everyone looked out for one another. You knew your neighbours. And yeah, it's like you were saying, I think sometimes there is this level of negativity towards council estate. I don't know if it's got the same kind of rep as it once did. Would you say
mm.
there's a different view now, or?
I think, like, on one level, it's changed. I remember, like, after I sort of moved out and my mum was still living there, my nan was still living there, I remember sort of like some friends sort of inviting me round to their flat, and it was on the estate I grew up on. And
Yeah.
these people had bought their flat and it looked completely different. I was
Mm.
like, this is like weird.
Yeah.
This estate is a place I grew up on, and now my, possibly middle class friends have bought a flat
Yeah.
on the estate. And I just found it really strange. It was sort of, and my nan's flat was just around the corner. And so I think there definitely is. Like, I think, there's still the stigma, but obviously people have bought the flats. They've bought
Yeah.
them, like the place I grew up in is not far from the centre of Brighton. If you want a cheaper property and you like, right, it's a nice place to live,
Mm.
But I mean, saying all of that, you can't discount the fact that parts of the estate, those 3 estates that I live in, are some of the most disadvantaged areas when it comes
Yeah.
to, like, and I hate that word disadvantage, but they are, like, when it across the country, when it comes to health, education, housing, and so clearly there are challenges. And yeah, that's why, I'm doing the other stuff I'm doing with Class Divide, because I sort of feel like, how can you know that and not want to do something about it?
Yeah. So yeah, this ties in nicely to class divide. Could you tell us a little bit about that and yeah, how that
Yeah.
came about and yeah, the beginnings
Yeah.
of that?
So I'd been like doing some stuff on the estate, not really to do with education. I was doing some photo projects with some residents, and we put on an exhibition in a place called the Crew Club, which is sort of one of the main youth centres or community centres in Whitehawk. And I ended up going to this event, which was at the community centre in the bottom of the flats where I used to live. And it was all about education, and it was being hosted by someone called Carly Goldsmith and Darren
Mm.
Snow. Darren was the founder of the Crew Club, and Carly grew up in Whitehawk and was working at the Crew Club at the time. And they'd been touring this presentation around all the different community places,
Mm.
and it was all about education. And they told this story about how, they'd been watching kids come into the Crew Club, and also listening to the council, who was sort of saying, education's great. The schools have got, good on their Ofsted reports, and as far as we're concerned, everything's fine, nothing to worry about. And they were sort of saying that doesn't match with what they're seeing with the kids that are coming into the Crew Club. They were
Yeah.
hearing sort of slightly more negative or difficult stories about experiences of education. And so Carly did an FOI request. So for those that don't know what that is, it's a freedom of information request that anyone can do to any public organisation. And so they did one of those to the council, asking for all the data specifically for the postcodes on the estates that
Mm.
I grew up on, and Carly was working in, and where the Crew Club was. And when they got that data back, what it highlighted was like a huge gulf in attainment between kids on the estate and kids living in the city centre. Like, sort of in the sort of higher 30s, 30% difference. You have like 67 odd percent of kids getting, basic GCSEs in the city centre, and 35% of kids, or 36% of kids on my old estate getting
Yeah.
basic GCSEs. So a huge sort of attainment gap, among other issues around suspensions and, kicking kids out of school and all sorts of stuff like that. And we had about a year of, pre-class divide, meeting with councils. There's a bit of a story. I went to that talk, and when I was listening to it, I was like, how can I not be involved in this? So I just joined. I just joined up with them and was like, I'm going to
Mm.
start coming to meetings. I'm going to start getting involved. I started recording some of the meetings and started to interview people, not really knowing what I was going to do with any of that. And we were having meetings with the council. They were saying stuff to us like, well, it's probably the parents' fault, isn't it? Or those kids don't have aspirations, or they're just not trying
Mm.
hard enough. The sort of stuff that is like horrific, really.
Yeah.
When you think about it, you really think about it, to hear people in the system, education professionals saying that sort of stuff, it was really upsetting. But after, I guess, a year or so of there not being any change in the council, we decided to go public. So we
Mm.
designed a zine. We got 4,000 of them printed. A whole group of us, and this was just actually at the start of COVID, but a whole group of us hand delivered them to like, I don't know, 3,500
Okay.
properties on the
Yeah,
estate.
yeah.
And what that zine did was tell the story from the point of view of families and from the estate. And
Yeah.
that story was, this isn't your fault individually. This is a systems problem, and you might think you're the only one dealing with this, dealing with a student or a child that's struggling in school, but you're not, and we're going to do something about it. Um, and so we did that, and around the same time, I guess, carried on doing interviews for
Mm.
a potential podcast that I had no idea what it was going to be, and that was the start of Class Divide. That was when we called it Class Divide, and you know we just carried on campaigning, getting people in the community who you would never normally hear at a council meeting doing a speech or a deputation or a petition. And so it was it was a mix of public campaigning, speeches at council meetings, really just trying to hold the council to account.
Yeah. And what was like the general feeling from the local community when you kind of started?
Hmm.
Was there a bit of pushback from the community?
Um, if there was pushback, there's no point. Like we've
Yeah.
tried, like, what's the point in even trying to change this? No one ever listens to us. We've tried before, or we're like this forgotten estate on the outskirts of Brighton, like, that nobody cares about.
Hmm.
It's just not even worth it. That was like, if there was pushback, it was that.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess people did get behind it though. I know Carly said this before, I think people felt that this was the last chance, that there wasn't gonna be another chance to sort of make some changes happen. And so I think it did bring people together, and I think it's weird, even though COVID was happening and we were all meeting remotely, in a way, that brought people together in a weird way. I think that made
Yeah.
people think about community, sort of, and the importance of it. And so, yeah, I think, yeah, there was some hesitation, but actually, ultimately, people did come together and were sort of into making change happen.
Okay. So yeah, so you did the campaign, and how did that kind of eventually work out? What happened
S-
there?
So I think we started like 5 or 6 years ago, and in Brighton, there's been really tricky politics. Like, there hasn't been a majority party in power for decades,
Mm.
and so you had that. That was making things difficult to change. Um, and what I decided to do while I was recording all the interviews was I just make a podcast series and I tell the story of a family in Whitehawk, plus a whole load of other stuff. But I
Mm.
focus very much on a family in Whitehawk who had quite different experiences of school. So you had brothers who went to the same school as me, and a sister who ended up getting an assisted place in a private day school. And so I basically made this multi-part documentary series. I had lots of people from the community speaking in it, plus I spoke to a load of experts, and even, I mean, obviously people in the community are experts as well, but
Mm.
education experts. Um, and we released that just before the local elections in Brighton. And it wasn't planned. It was like one of those lucky things. We didn't know anything about politics really, or how any of that stuff works. So it was luck really. But it turns out that some of the candidates, some of the people that were trying to become councillors in the Labour Party specifically,
Yeah.
were listening to the podcast. And not only that, when they were going to doorsteps knocking on doors to try and canvass and get people to support them, people were saying to them, "Have you heard that podcast? We want education to change."
Yeah.
And what it meant was the Labour group wrote it into into their manifesto for the election. They included a line saying, "We're going to make some changes," and those changes were focused on transport to school, because that was one of the things parents were saying was an issue, because there was no school in the community that had shut 20 years ago.
Yeah.
That's the school I went to. It shut down. The Guardian called it the school that died of poverty, which, says a lot. Um, so they wanted better transport, and they wanted better access to different schools across the city because of where the estate was placed. It's on the outskirts, and because of political motivations over decades, residents in on those estates have very much been locked out of any sort of choice of any other school. And if you listen to the podcast series, I sort of talk a bit about what happens when you have so-called sink estate schools. It's a horrible term, but you know, that's very much what happened in Brighton. You had schools in the so-called leafy suburbs, in the city centre, that had very low numbers of free school meal kids in them, and
Mm.
then you had kids where from estates like Whitehawk and, you know, kids from my old estate, they were all being shepherded or made to go to, you know, certain schools on the
Yeah.
outskirts. So they had like up to 50% free school meal kids in them. And so, you know, the other aspect of the campaign was to change that, to make some choice available to parents who just didn't really have any choice in the school system. So the Labour Party included that in the manifesto and then won a huge majority in Brighton, and so took over the council. And I guess that kick-started a couple of years of
Mm.
pretty intense activity as
Yeah.
they announced various changes that were going to happen in Brighton.
Okay, and I'm guessing it was all successful, and now you want to take it nationwide.
Yeah, so most of the things went through, but not without sort of battles. And I think,
Mm.
you know, the series two goes into this. You know, like Brighton. I don't know. You know, if you're listening and you're thinking, "Oh, Brighton, yeah, that's a sort of open, liberal,
Mm.
sort of fair, kind place." And I think on the whole, it is. But there's huge inequality, like a lot of places, but huge inequality, and it's very segregated, as I mentioned about the schools. And, you know, there was a lot of opposition, you know, and I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, but, you know, from parents in some of the areas where the so-called best schools are, and I use that phrase sort of loosely, really, um, there were people that campaigned really hard to
Yeah.
stop policies like giving priority to kids on free school meals in the admissions process. They campaigned really hard to try and stop some of that stuff through fear that their kids may not get into the school that they hoped they would get into. So, yeah, those things passed. And even to the point where people took them to the National Schools Adjudicator and opposed them through that. Unfortunately, the schools adjudicator came back in support and said, actually, school admissions are a valuable way to increase inclusivity in the school system. So that's
Mm.
brilliant. And so, yeah, we are now sort of working on ways that those changes might be applied nationally.
Okay. Good luck with all of that.
Mm.
It sounds like it's gonna be quite the battle and a lot of hard work.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the intro, where I talk about you now managed to buy your own home. We've talked previously. You don't actually live in Brighton no longer, do you?
No, no.
Yeah. So yeah, could you tell us about that and what made you decide to kind of move away from
Yeah,
Brighton?
I've never really told this story properly before, partly because I guess there's a bit of fear, you know, like there's definitely a weirdness about coming from my background and owning a home for a start.
Mm.
That's weird. Not only that, I own a home in the Lake District,
Yeah.
which, you know, your initial thoughts listening, watching this might be like, what the fuck? Like, um, so there is a bit of an explanation, you know, like 5 years ago, I had never lived away from Brighton, never. I never saw it was just never a thing I imagined I would be able to do.
Mm.
And probably partly because of my background. I just thought I'll just be in Brighton forever. You know, I can't afford it. I've never owned a property. I'd always rented. And like it was sort of, I guess, during COVID, and my nan, who I guess was my last family member with a connection to where I grew up, passed away during COVID, and I was quite involved in sort of some of the care stuff that was going on
Yeah.
in her last her last year or so, and so that happened, and the COVID thing happened, and then me and my partner, we were like, why don't we just go away somewhere for a year on an adventure? Like, you know, it was just a harebrained scheme, no idea if it would
Mm.
work and so we found a really cheap place to rent in the Lake District. and much like half the price of living in Brighton. It was
Yeah.
crazy, really, and bigger, um, and we just thought we'll just go away for a year and have an adventure and then move back. Um, and that year became 2 years, and then 3 years, and then the person we were renting the place off wanted to sell up, and we were like, "Oh, shit, what are we gonna do?" And, like, I guess because life is what is actually quite cheap here, we've been putting all the money away that we'd been saving from not living in a city,
Yeah.
and we're just like, "Right, like, let's see if we can buy it." I mean, honestly, actually, at first, we just thought, "There's no way we can do it. We're just gonna have to we're just gonna have to move. There's no way we can
Mm.
do it." And, you know, I don't know, people kept saying to us, "Why don't you just try? Why don't you try it?" And it was really not a sort of pleasant experience speaking to people like mortgage advisors, because they sort of, like, were just looking down on how much I earn, and,
Yeah.
people couldn't believe, like, I remember, like, a couple of them were like, "What what is that all that's all you earn? Like, you there's no way anyone's gonna take you seriously." It pushed so many sort of painful buttons for me
Mm.
about my background and, like, where I'd got to, and, like, how much I earn and what
Mm.
savings I didn't have, and, you know, it was very uncomfortable, and yeah, but then we found someone who was actually a kind mortgage advisor who somehow, through some sort of magic, God knows how, I daren't ask, somehow managed to get us a mortgage, probably the most expensive mortgage known to mankind.
No, no, it's good. It sounds like everything worked out, and yeah, because you have moved away from Brighton, and do the people back in Brighton ever think anything differently
Hmm.
because you've moved away, especially moving to
Yeah.
Lake District?
Yeah, there was a bit of backlash actually during the sort of quite intense campaigning when some people from the opposition realised I didn't live in Brighton and then
Yeah.
tracked me down. I don't know how they tracked me down. It's probably not that hard. I've never hidden it. I've never actually hidden it. So, and then started posting about it publicly on Facebook, and
Mm.
that was pretty harsh. Um, because I sort of wanted to say, well, you know what? There's 300,000 other people in Brighton. I'm happy to pass the baton over to someone else that can do what I'm doing. Like, I don't have to, like, commute down to Brighton all the time and do this
Yeah.
and give up my spare time to do this. I could probably just relax in my sleepy village, and do some gardening. Um, but I don't wanna do that. So, I'm a bit like the drum machine, a bit like learning how to use a sampler. I'm obsessed with
Yeah.
fixing this stuff. And so that uncomfortableness around not living in Brighton anymore, or sort of being told, "Oh, who am I to be like like dabbling or messing with school stuff in a place I don't even live in?"
Yeah.
I'm a person that cares about thousands of kids who don't come from an advantaged background. I'm that person,
Mm.
like, and I will remain that person. And so now I'm sort of like, I don't care, like, this is where I live, and I'm proud of the fact I've done what I've done, and, this is the life I've chosen to have, and it would be weird to sort of not be proud of that.
Yeah. Was there ever like a moment where you thought, I need to just pack this in, like move back, or like you mentioned with the Facebook and all that? Was that a moment where it really made you question, should you carry on doing all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I ever got to the point where I was like, "Oh, I can't do this," 'cause, I'm not gonna give in to, like, there was some real nasty stuff, like
Hmm.
people accusing our campaign of being right wing, of then being ultra left wing, of just all sorts of weird sort of accusations, and, I ended up being quoted in the Daily Mail and the Daily Express in an article about starting a class war in Brighton, and even amongst all that stuff, even amongst those days when actually it was horrendous,
Hmm.
for not just for me, but for others in the campaign. I would have carried on, and I did carry on. You know, I just it's not something you can give up on. Um, and I guess it's another thing that I count myself lucky that I can carry on doing it. That somehow I've managed to sort of keep my mental health on track
Yeah.
and keep my paid work going and juggle all those things. and carry on doing the stuff that actually brings me a lot of joy, being
Mm.
in this community thing, being in amongst people from similar backgrounds to me, and people from different backgrounds to me who are all fighting for this really important thing.
Yeah. Um, yeah, because you are working self-employed, you are freelance. How have you found that aspect with the finance aspect to it, especially as you mentioned, you growing up with not much.
Yeah, it's a roller coaster. It always has been. I think the last time I had an actual job, I would have been maybe 24, 25.
Mm.
So half my life ago. Like, I'm in my early 50s now. Um, so it's just a constant roller coaster. And actually, there's been periods where I've had to sign on. There's been periods where, like, probably in my 20s, even into my 30s, there's been periods where I'm like, I've got no work. I've got no stuff coming in, and I'm gonna
Mm.
have to get some help. Um, so and I hate that aspect. There's times when I'm like, "Oh god, I I would sort of give anything to not have to have that constant sort of, like, not knowing, because it's sort of, I don't know, it sort of picks at all sorts of things, from feeling like I'm just not very good with money, feeling like I'm not very good at selling myself, feeling like I'm not
Mm.
very good at what I do generally, not good enough to sort of constantly have loads of clients or a sort of solid pipeline. Um, so yeah, it's that bit of it I sort of really don't like, and I'm not a particularly good salesperson. So it's sort of a delicate balancing act
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
like, trying to not be pulled into a sort of bit of darkness, when
Yeah.
you're in that sort of dip and work has dried up a little bit, trying not to let it consume you.
It's kind of like a full circle moment now because as I mentioned in the intro, you won that award with your
Mm,
brother, and it's like your beginnings, like borrowing equipment, getting on the Prince's Trust, and now you're winning awards with your brother. Could you
mm.
tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, look, I'm a sort of little bit of that project, like all the projects, and I hate sort of feeling like it's not my like, basically, there's a bit in the podcast of our podcast, second episode, right at the start, where we're standing on a hill looking over the estate. And I tell a little bit of a story about there being this Neolithic camp at the top of this hill, and it's one of the first places people apparently settled in Brighton, on this hill that almost separates, like, the city centre and the council estate that I grew up on. And my brother was there. He was doing some sound recording and assisting, and whilst I was busy doing lots of other stuff, he had this crazy idea about doing some sort of project that would basically be an extra bit of the podcast, but we'd get kids to basically work on it. We'd get
Mm.
holiday kids on the estate to work on it. And he just went down a rabbit hole about that whole Neolithic stuff. And it basically, Brighton Festival got in touch with us. They were like, can we commission you to do something for the festival? I think it was 2024. Um, and I was like, "Yeah, actually, that's a good idea." It's another way of doing a bit of campaigning and telling people about what we're doing. And I mentioned it to Simon, and he was like, "I've got this idea. Basically, we're going to, like, make this Neolithic soundscape. We're gonna train the kids up to do a load of recording and, like, make this amazing piece of art." And he'd read this book by this archaeologist called Cecil Curwen, I think his name was. It was written in the 20s. He'd discovered a load of this Neolithic stuff, and he'd written this line when he found a whole load of skeletons. He was like, um, "They buried their babies in their rubbish dumps. They must have been cannibals. They must have been Neolithic cannibals." And Simon was like, that feels a little bit like the way some people talk about people on the estate. So I'm going to call this project Neolithic Cannibals.
Mm.
Um, and it was this amazing exhibition that was on for the month of May in 2024. And yeah, it won this Sound of the Year award, which was brilliant. And he always used to say when it was on, he was like, "Come for the drones, but leave by the class divide sort of exhibition section, because you sort of had this journey you went through. You sort of
Yeah.
walked in, you stood in this surround sound sort of thing with this massive screen, which I did a whole load of visuals for. And then you had to leave via this little section that had a whole load of campaigning stuff. So you sort
Yeah.
of primed people with some cool sounds, and it's like, oh, this is part of an education campaign. So yeah, I just, it was just another way of us trying to get people to think about. It was all about listening, right? We got kids
Yeah,
to do a
yeah,
load of
yeah.
listening. We got kids to think differently about listening to their worlds and then making some stuff. And
Mm.
then we invited audiences in the city centre to come and listen to those kids. And everything we've been doing at Class Divide is about saying, we don't think communities like Whitehawk are listened to enough. They've got
Yeah, yeah,
voices,
yeah,
they're
yeah.
constantly saying stuff, but we don't think they're listened to enough. And so it was just a continuation of that, really.
No, that's a really good story. And like, did in the Whitehawk estate, was that kind of part of it as well? Did they hear about this, and yeah, what were their
Yeah.
kind of views on it all?
I mean, we had like a launch party. We invited people to come from the campaign and all the families. And so there's this sort of big event, and we did whatever we could to get as many people to come along. The thing is, and this is something I come up against all the time, when you don't invest that much time and effort with art and culture, or
Mm.
that sort of art and culture, the sort of stuff Brighton Festival put on, when you have, I mean, forever not investing in people from places like Whitehawk being involved in that sort of stuff, there's a sense that you don't belong in those worlds.
Yeah.
That it's not for you. So that's like a long-term piece of work that I think a lot of people are still struggling with. So yeah, people came, but not enough. And it's not because they're not clever enough or arty enough, or it's mainly because they probably don't feel like they belong. It's not
Yeah.
part of their world. And, I don't know. I don't know exactly what it is, but, you know, that sort of art world is not designed for people from my background. And you have to sort of there's loads of work that needs to be done to make sure that, stuff like that is inclusive. And there's not enough of that happening yet.
Would you say there's some change actually happening since doing that project, or since some of the campaign that you've done? Have you seen any kind of change?
In the art world or in generally.
Just generally.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously there's been policy change. The school policy changes have happened. So yeah, like there are people in the city that are thinking differently. Like we are a non-political party, but I have to hand it to a bunch of the Labour councillors that were voted
Mm.
in a few years ago, who are like, this city's like, it's completely unfair. We're going to basically push through a load of new policies that prioritise the sort of least advantaged in the city. So yeah, there's definitely change in some areas,
Mm.
but not enough.
Yeah.
And it will easily be forgotten. It will easily, like there's elections next year in Brighton. Who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah.
And, you've got to constantly push for this stuff. As you all know, you've interviewed loads of people, right? And you write about this on LinkedIn and talk about this all the time. Class, for one, and I use that as a catch-all for
Mm.
like lower economic groups and council estate communities, and you know they're like this invisible group
Mm.
that sometimes some institutions and some groups and some organizations will pay a little bit of lip service to and go, yep, of course we're prioritizing those groups and we want to do everything we can to make stuff accessible. But when you really sort of dig deep, you realize it's not particularly deep. Like I say,
Yeah.
there are some groups that are doing good stuff, but actually the systemic change, like, it's not really happening. And I'm not saying it's any one group's or one individual's fault. It's definitely not. It's a major issue with the way funding
Mm.
works and the way the whole sort of all these sort of structures and systems are set up, whether it's education or health or housing or arts or whatever. Um, but yeah, there is a lot of work to do. And yeah, I'd welcome anyone getting involved, specifically in education stuff and art stuff, which is probably my areas of interest.
Yeah. And yeah, when it comes to art, do you feel like the working classes are getting more of a look in now, or is it still bit of a
Well,
barrier there.
the stats don't paint a pretty picture. I mean, I'm not gonna reel them off the top of my head, but I'm pretty certain, like, in sort of, arts and creative sort of industries, some of the percentages are in sort of under 10%, of the
Mm.
sort of workforce come from my sort of background. Um, and it'll be worse in stuff like opera, obviously, in some of those so-called high class
Yeah,
arts worlds, and it's really bad. Like, if you think about where all decisions are made in politics and in policy, like, I mean, I've got some stuff in, I think it's episode 3, series 2, interviewing, um, like some people about that stuff and how underrepresentative those worlds are of
yeah,
people from our backgrounds. And you think, is it any wonder, we're seeing the politics we're seeing right now? you
yeah.
know, because like if I hear once more that, Keir Starmer's dad was a toolmaker and that there's some sort of virtual signaling going on there that him and his front bench are all working class, it's a
Mm.
nonsense.
Yeah,
It's, I'm not saying, of course, I know some of them went to state schools, but they also then went on to, like institutions that are places full of very middle class people,
mm.
some of the top end universities where you end up with a sort of quite, like, narrow kind of thought,
Yeah, yeah.
and, that's the politics we have right now.
Mm. And for yourself, did you ever find you had any, like, class barriers, or you noticed people were slightly different with you because of your background at any point during your
Um,
career?
I I don't think I really picked up on it that much
Yeah.
when I was in my late teens, but I think, like, if I look back, I did, like, as well as doing, like, music, I got heavily involved in radio in my late teens and 20s, and I've probably made radio, now podcasting, most of my life in some shape
Mm.
or form. And I would have been surrounded by people that came from quite different backgrounds to me, and, you know, I don't know how I would have described it back then. Maybe I just thought people weren't very friendly. Maybe they were, I don't know. I just remember it being quite cliquey. I remember some of those places being sort of
Mm.
quite, like, not fitting in, and there being,
Yeah.
like, a little group of us that sort of kept ourselves to ourselves, and,
Yeah.
so, yes, probably. I mean, I tell this story in the Classified podcast. There was a point in my late 20s where I had to do some public speaking stuff, and I'm so nervous with that. I'm actually better now, but I was so frightened of doing that stuff, and I think that's probably to do with my background and a sense of, like, imposter syndrome and all of that
Mm.
stuff. But I went to this thing called Toastmasters, which is like a sort of evening thing you go to once a week, and you get support in doing public speaking, and you do a talk, and I did my first talk, and someone came up to me at the end of that talk, and they were like, "It's a really interesting subject matter, but you really need to sort your voice out. You could do some elocution lessons." And that shit, I mean,
Yeah.
that's crazy. Um, so yeah, I have faced some of that stuff around accent, and I've probably changed my accent. In fact, I know I've changed my accent over the years to fit in, and
Mm.
you know, um, yeah, it's a shame. I wish I hadn't.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's been quite a common thing across this series where people have had to kind of alter their accent depending on the professional environment that they're working in. So yeah, it's a lot more common than people would probably um, think it was. Was there any kind of like words of advice, any final things that you wanted to highlight, or anything that you think is quite important that like viewers or listeners should kind of take note?
I'd say, I mean, I don't know if this is advice, and I'm going to say this with as much gentleness and kindness as possible. This is really something for, like, people watching that maybe come from a slightly more advantaged background or have some sort of privilege, or and I say it, I'm going to say this really gently because nobody chooses the family they're born
Mm.
into. So, I think you've got to be really careful with this stuff. But as in, I have to recognize the privilege I have of being a white man,
Mm.
and what that gives me,
Yeah.
and accept that has opened doors that it wouldn't have done for other people. with differences. I would love to see more people be open and honest about maybe what their background has done for them,
Yeah.
and what that means and why that might be different for other people. And it isn't about saying like, this is my fault, or it's about acknowledging that we exist in this
Mm.
system that is actually unfair, and some people end up in better situations than others. And the more we can all do to recognize that, I think we would be in a much better place, I think, if there was a little bit more transparency and openness about luck, and
Mm.
specifically the biggest bit of luck, which is the postcode and family you were born into,
Yeah.
and what that means. So yeah, it's not really advice, it's just like, let's all try and be a bit more open about that stuff, and acknowledge what that means to our work and the way we sort of exist in the world.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to finish this off, actually, because yeah, a lot of the times when I asked that towards the end of my previous, it's a good way of like highlighting your recognizing your own privilege. And yeah, like you said, I think it's saying it in a way that's a bit more soft and tender. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I
but I
mean,
mean,
a lot of my friends, right, are in those worlds, and I
yeah,
recognize that.
yeah,
So I often feel like when I'm working class divide stuff, that I'm like, oh God, like I really don't want to upset my friends. I don't want to,
yeah,
and I really mean that. I don't. And so I do mean it in a really gentle way. I don't want anyone to
yeah,
sort of like watch this and go, oh God, how awful. What a horrible person I am. And Curtis thinks I'm, because it isn't really like that. That isn't how I feel about it. It's
yeah.
sort of much more about some transparency and openness and about it.
Yeah, no, and I feel, yeah, I totally agree. I think, yeah, if people were a bit more open and honest about stuff, then might be in a completely different world. But
Yeah.
in terms of if anyone wants to get in touch with you or see the work that you're doing, where's best to reach out?
So Class Divide, we've got a website, classdivide.co.uk. We're on social media. We couldn't get Class Divide, so we're Divide Class,
Oh,
on Instagram, and we are on like some of the other things like Twitter and stuff like that, but we don't really use it that much.
yeah,
Instagram and Facebook probably the main places we're on. And my work stuff, my work website is wearefieldwork.com, and yeah, there's a bunch of stuff on there about work I'm up to at the moment. But just get in touch. If you want to chat about stuff, I'm always open for chats.
cool. Yeah, no, I'll put that all in the description below. And yeah, no, thank you again for being a guest. And
Great.
yeah, to all of my viewers and listeners, you should definitely listen to Class Dividers. It's a great podcast. So thanks again, Curtis.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Initial Step. If you resonate with the stories we share and have a similar background you'd like to talk about, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch and maybe you'll be featured in an upcoming episode. And don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Be sure to check out our previous episodes for more inspiring stories. Until next time, we'll see you in the next one.